Look at the lowercase letters on your screen right now. These letters, their shapes, their proportions, the way they sit on a line, were designed over 1200 years ago in the court of a king who could barely write his own name. And the program that created those letters also saved almost everything we know about ancient Rome. Without it, no Livy, no Tacitus, no Polybius. This is the story of Charlemagne's standardization program, the most consequential act of cultural preservation in Western history. So how did a Frankish king who struggled to write create the most important handwriting reform ever? It starts with a problem. Before Charlemagne, learning in Western Europe was an artisanal enterprise. A few monks in a few scattered monasteries copied text by hand, each region using its own script. Merovingian script in Francia, Visigothic script in Spain, Beneventan script in southern Italy. These regional hands were often nearly illegible to anyone outside the local area. A monk in Tours could not easily read a manuscript from Toledo. Clergy frequently could not actually read the Latin they recited in church services. They mouthed the words as memorized sounds with no comprehension, and the written record was vanishing. Only 26 non-religious manuscripts survived from the entire 200-year period between 550 and 750. 2 centuries of European civilization, and we have 26 secular texts to show for it. The empire Charlemagne inherited was vast and multi-ethnic, without standardized writing, standardized language, standardized worship. Administration was incoherent. Communication across the realm was breaking down. Charlemagne's solution was comprehensive. This was not just about pretty handwriting. It was a full-spectrum standardization program designed to hold an empire together. First, handwriting, a new script called Carolingian Minuscule, small, clear, rounded, uniform letters that anyone trained in the system could read regardless of where they lived. Second, spelling. Latin spelling was regularized across the empire, eliminating regional variations. Third, liturgy. The same ceremonies performed in Barcelona, Aachen, and Rome. Fourth, church law. Uniform legal codes for ecclesiastical discipline. Fifth, education. Clergy trained to actually read and understand Latin, not just recite memorized formulas. And sixth, manuscript copying on a systematic scale. To staff this program, Charlemagne recruited an international team. Alcuin of Northumbria, trained in the tradition of the Venerable Bede, the greatest scholar of the age, Theodulf of Orleans, a Visigoth, Paul the Deacon, a Lombard from Italy, Einhard, a Frank. This was a deliberate cosmopolitan project. The copying effort drew manuscripts primarily from Italy, from Ravenna, Monte Cassino, and Rome, and brought them north to monasteries equipped for systematic reproduction. The key centers, Aachen, the imperial capital, Corbie and Tours in Francia, St. Gall, Lorsch, and Reichenau in the Germanic lands. The scale of growth was extraordinary. Take Reichenau Monastery on Lake Constance. In the year 800, its library held about 50 books. By 846, it held 1,000, a 20-fold increase in under 50 years, and Reichenau was just one center among many. Multiply that growth across dozens of monasteries, and the scope of the program becomes clear. Here is the Reichenau case in numbers: 50 books in 800, 1,000 by 846. This single monastery grew its collection 20-fold in less than half a century. This was not accidental accumulation. It was organized, funded, deliberate production, and the results across the entire network of Carolingian monasteries transformed what survived of the ancient world. The numbers tell a stark story. From the entire period, 550 to 750, 2 centuries, only 26 non-religious manuscripts survive. From the 9th century alone, the peak of the Carolingian copying program, 290 classical manuscripts survive. That is an 11-fold increase. And after the Carolingian peak, The number drops again, about 150 from the 10th century. The 9th century was the critical window. This was not a gradual accumulation of texts over time. It was a concentrated burst of organized copying that captured classical literature at the last possible moment before the fragile originals, many on papyrus, disintegrated entirely. Now narrow the focus. For several of the most important ancient authors, the entire tradition, everything we possess, hangs by a single thread. One Carolingian manuscript, Polybius, the Greek historian of Rome's rise to power. Livy, who wrote the monumental history of Rome from its founding. Tacitus, our primary source for the early Roman Empire. Each survives essentially through one Carolingian copy. If that single manuscript had been lost to fire, to flood, to neglect, we would have nothing. Consider Livy. His 5th decade, books 41 through 45, survives because Lodge Monastery held the unique copy transcribed from a papyrus Italian original that has long since turned to dust. Or consider Cicero's Republic. It survives as what scholars call a palimpsest, a manuscript where the original text was scraped off the parchment and overwritten with a religious text. Parchment was expensive, recycling was common. Modern imaging techniques have recovered the underlying Cicero, but only barely. One common misconception that Renaissance scholars discovered classical texts. They did not. When Poggio Bracciolini and others found manuscripts of Lucretius or Quintilian in the 15th century, they found them in northern European monasteries, where Carolingian monks had copied and stored them 6 centuries earlier. The Carolingians did the saving, the Renaissance did the repopularizing. The intellectual character of this program matters. This was not a culture that valued original thinking. Preservation and orthodoxy, faithfulness to received tradition were the highest virtues. The story of Amalarius of Metz makes the point sharply. Amalarius was a liturgical scholar who proposed innovative interpretations of church ceremonies. He was condemned. What made his case worse, he claimed he had found truth within his own spirit. This was deeply improper. Orthodoxy meant truth came from scripture and the church fathers, from tradition and authority, never from individual insight. The empire faced 2 theological controversies in this period: iconoclasm, the debate over whether religious images were permissible, mirroring disputes in Byzantium, and adoptionism, the heresy, strong in Spain, that Christ was a human adopted by God. Both were resolved by appeal to established authority, not creative theology. Pull back to the broadest view. Charlemagne's program created a bottleneck through which classical civilization passed. Almost everything we know about Roman literature, history, and thought was filtered through this single deliberate effort. And the script they standardized had one more legacy to deliver. When Renaissance humanists found Carolingian manuscripts centuries later, the handwriting was so clear and elegant that they mistook it for ancient Roman writing. And they modeled their typefaces on it. Those typefaces became the basis for modern print. And the lowercase letters on your screen right now are a direct legacy of Charlemagne's core. This was not a program of genius or creativity. It was a program of discipline, organization, and respect for the past, and yet its consequences were more far-reaching than almost any act of original thought in the medieval world. The survival of Western classical literature is not an accident. It is the result of a deliberate choice made in the 8th and 9th centuries to copy, standardize, and preserve before it was too late.